Chapter 10 Politics and the Copper Kings, 1889 to 1904. The Big Picture. When Montana became a state, many different forces fought one another for control of its rich resources. It was a constant challenge to keep Montana's government in the hands of the people. Gold lured the first prospectors to Montana, and silver attracted industrialists, but it was copper that carried Montana's economy into the 20th century. Electric motors, telephone and telegraph wires, and electric power lines all used copper. Some of the richest veins of copper in the world lay under the Butte Hill, and as the world's demand for copper soared, Butte's mines expanded. Copper mining required enormous amounts of lumber, so Montana's lumber industry developed right alongside the copper industry.
See Chapter 12.
Railroads built transportation networks to support these industries, and also brought skilled labor into Montana to work in the mines, smelters, lumber yards, and cities.
See Chapter 9.
The worldwide demand for copper brought growth, prosperity, and new opportunities, including the chance for Montana Territory to become a state. But the rich resource also caused problems, as conflicting interests competed for power. The road to statehood. Euro-American immigrants started pushing for statehood almost as soon as they arrived in the territory. They did not like living in a territory where they could not vote for their own governor. They did not like that the federal government controlled the territory's funds and appointed government leaders. And they wanted true representation in Congress. The territory's congressional representative could lobby,
try to influence
congressmen and senators, but he could not vote. Once it became a state, Montana could control its own funds, Montanans could elect their own governor, judges, and state officers. Montana would gain 1 seat in the U.S. House of Representatives and 2 seats in the U.S. Senate. The state legislature,
the branch of government that passes laws,
could tax corporations, so that at least some money earned from Montana's resources would stay to benefit Montana. And statehood came with a large land grant,
free land that the federal government gives to a company, an organization, or a state,
to help fund education. Montana's early constitutional conventions. Even though a territory could not apply for statehood until its non-Indian population reached 60,000, citizens called Montana's first constitutional convention
a meeting to write a constitution
in 1866. Having a constitution,
a document that sets the rules for government,
was an important step towards statehood. But at the time, fewer than 20,000 non-Indians lived in the territory. The 1866 Constitution was not even presented to the people for a vote. It was too early for Montana to become a state. Montanans called their second constitutional convention in 1884. Citizens elected delegates,
representatives of the people,
to go to the convention and draft a state constitution. Voters approved it by a huge margin, but national politics got in the way. That year, Democrats controlled the U.S. House of Representatives, and Republicans controlled the U.S. Senate. House Democrats wanted to increase their power by admitting territories with mostly Democratic voters, like Montana, into the Union. The Republican Senate wanted to admit only territories whose citizens would vote Republican, like Washington and Dakota. For 5 years, neither side would allow the other's territories to gain statehood. 1889, statehood at last. The 1888 election swept a new group of politicians into Congress. They voted to admit Montana, Washington, and North and South Dakota as states. On February 25, 1889, President Grover Cleveland signed into law a bill allowing Montana to become a state. People called it the Enabling Act. The next step was to write a constitution. Montana's Constitution. Who gets control? In July 1889, Montana held a new constitutional convention to write a constitution for Montana's voters to ratify.
Formally approve.
75 delegates gathered in Helena for the convention. They included mine owners, stockmen, farmers, merchants, real estate agents, and politicians. There were 39 Democrats and 36 Republicans. Two big fights arose during the convention. Both of them pitted the mining interests and related industries like railroads and lumber mills against farmers and ranchers. By this time, copper had grown into such an important industry that the owners of large copper mines and smelters had tremendous power, and they were used to getting what they wanted. How should the legislature be structured? The first fight erupted over representation to the state Senate. Delegates from sparsely populated eastern counties wanted each county to elect one state senator, no matter how many people lived in that county. This would give rural counties more power. Delegates from the mining towns wanted representation in the Senate to be based on population, as it was in the state House of Representatives. This would give the heavily populated mining areas more power. As the debate raged on, Montanans realized how much the copper interests wanted to control the legislature. Eventually, however, the mining interests gave in and agreed to the one county, one senator plan. They worried that voters would not ratify the Constitution otherwise. Who should pay the most taxes? The second fight arose over taxes on mines. The mining industry insisted that state taxes on mines should be especially low, because mining was so important to Montana's economy. For most of Montana Territory's history, mines had paid very little in taxes, even though they yielded many more millions of dollars than ranching or any other industry. Mine owners wanted to write this special tax status into the Constitution so that legislatures could not change it later, because changing the Constitution requires a majority of all voters. This time, the mining interests refused to compromise. As a result, Montana's first state constitution called for mines to be taxed only on the value of the original mining claim. Most original mining claims cost $5, even the ones that produced millions of dollars of copper or silver. This measure had a lasting impact in Montana. It severely limited how much Montana could benefit from its own natural resources. It also meant that ranchers and other businesses in Montana paid most of the state's expenses for many years. Should women get to vote? The delegates agreed on almost all the rest of the 1889 Constitution. The federal government had given detailed instructions about what states should include in their constitutions, and the convention followed these instructions. Delegates did debate one other controversial,
provoking disagreement
measure: whether to allow women the right to vote. At that time, no state in the Union allowed women's suffrage.
The right to vote.
Clara McAdoo, an extremely successful businesswoman from Billings, lobbied hard for women's suffrage. She talked to every delegate, asking them to give the vote to persons instead of just men. Nearly half the delegates said they would, but leaders of the convention thought that Montana's male voters might not ratify the Constitution if it included women's suffrage. The delegates did not want anything to delay Montana from becoming a state. Women's suffrage was defeated, 43 to 25. Women in Montana could not vote until 1914. The War of the Copper Kings. Two of the richest copper tycoons,
wealthy businessmen,
were Marcus Daly and William A. Clark. They were so rich and owned so many mines that people called them the Copper Kings. Both men worked to keep mining taxes low during the Constitutional Convention, and both were leaders in the Democratic Party. But they disagreed about almost everything else. Clark and Daly were extremely competitive, and they liked getting their own way. Their arguments exploded into a battle so public, so expensive, and so nasty that it became known as the War of the Copper Kings. Their first fight came in 1888, a year before statehood, when William Clark ran as a Democrat for the office of Territorial Representative to Congress. He expected to win because most Montanans were Democrats. But Daley had his own goals. Daley owned lumber companies that had been illegally cutting timber on public lands, and his companies were in trouble with the federal government. He knew that a Democrat would not be able to protect his business interests from a Republican-controlled government. So Daley worked to elect Clark's Republican opponent, Thomas H. Carter. He gave out free whiskey and cigars to any man who said he would vote against Clark. He also told all his employees and contractors that they would lose their jobs if they voted for Clark. At that time, people's votes were not secret as they are now, so Daley could easily find out how his employees voted. The voters were so enraged at this obvious control that in 1889, Montana became one of the first states in the Union to adopt the secret ballot. Clark lost the election by 5,000 votes. He became Daley's bitter enemy. Clark tries to buy a Senate seat. When Montana became a state, Clark had another chance to run for office, this time the U.S. Senate. At that time, only members of state legislatures voted for U.S. senators. This changed in Montana in 1911. In 1890, Montana's first state legislature met. Clark hoped the legislators would elect him to one of Montana's 2 Senate seats. But Montana's first legislature was such a disaster that its members could not agree on 2 senators. The legislature was so evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, and the 2 parties fought so much, that nothing got done. So each party elected its own senators, and Montana sent 4 U.S. senators to Washington, D.C. That year, Republicans controlled the U.S. Senate. They seated the 2 Republican senators and sent the 2 Democrats, including William Clark, home. The next Senate election was in 1893. By this time, Clark wanted to be a U.S. Senator so much that he was willing to bribe,
offer illegal payments,
the legislators for their votes. Daley wanted Clark defeated just as strongly. He found out how much Clark had bribed each legislator, then paid each one the same amount to change his vote. When the day came for the legislature to vote, Clark was confident of victory. He sat in the legislative chamber, fingering the pages of his acceptance speech, but he lost by 3 votes. Both Clark and Daley accused each other of bribery and corruption.
dishonesty.
The legislature voted again and again over 50 days, and never did agree on who should be Montana's second senator. For the next 2 years, Montana had only 1 U.S. senator. 1894. Clark, Daley, and the Capitol fight. The next time Clark and Daley clashed, it was over the location of the state capitol. State government can be incredibly valuable to a town. It pours money into the community, pays for land and buildings, creates jobs in the area, and adds prestige to the town. It also gives local residents constant access to their state leaders, which was important to business tycoons like Clark and Daley. In 1892, the voters were asked to choose between 7 towns: Helena, Boulder, Bozeman, Butte, Deer Lodge, Great Falls, and Anaconda. This last one a town founded by Marcus Daley and named for his mining company. None of the choices won a majority,
more than half,
of the votes. The top 2 cities were Helena, with 30% of the votes, and Anaconda, with 22%. So in the next election, 2 years later, voters would decide between Helena and Anaconda. It was the perfect setup to pitch William A. Clark against Marcus Daley. Once again, the Copper Kings battled to control the election. Daley wanted the capital in his own town of Anaconda, the site of his huge copper smelter. But Clark had made a secret agreement with some Helena businessmen that he would support Helena as the capital if they would help him get elected to the U.S. Senate. Once again, Clark and Daley applied all their resources to persuade voters. They sponsored parades, speeches, and fireworks. They distributed free cigars, drinks, and $5 bills to win people's loyalty. Clark handed out miniature men's shirt collars made of copper to symbolize the stranglehold the Anaconda Mining Company would have on Montana if Anaconda won. Daley opened Anaconda for Capital clubs across the state and turned them into social centers. To gain more influence, the two men also bought newspapers, or paid editors to support their cause. Marcus Daly already owned the Anaconda Standard. Soon he also purchased the Great Falls Tribune. William Clark already owned the Butte Miner. Soon he also controlled Missoula's daily paper as well. Many small-town weekly editors also took their orders from either Clark or Daly. It was a close election, but Helena won, 27,028 to 25,118. Later it was said that Clark had spent nearly $500,000 on the Capitol fight, and that Daly had spent more than $2.5 million. Since only 52,000 men could vote, the two Copper Kings had spent $56, which is equal to $1,356 today per voting man. 1899. The feud continues. In 1899, William A. Clark once again ran for the U.S. Senate. This time, he vowed to get himself elected, no matter the cost. Once again, when the state legislature set about to elect another U.S. senator, Clark was one of the candidates. This time he knew he would win. But just as the state senate met to vote, a young state senator from Flathead County named Fred Whiteside stood up, waved 4 envelopes containing $30,000 in cash, and said a representative of Clark had paid 4 senators to vote for Clark for U.S. Senate. A grand jury was called to investigate. Whiteside and the 3 other senators testified that Clark had tried to bribe them. Clark denied it. He said it was all a plot by Marcus Daly. The grand jury chose not to
decide to prosecute
anyone. A few weeks later, the legislature elected Clark to the U.S. Senate. Later evidence showed that Clark had paid between $5,000 and $25,000 to each legislator he had bribed. Only 13 legislators had turned him down. In all, his U.S. Senate seat had cost him $1 million in bribes, close to $21 million in today's dollars. When Senator Clark went to Washington, Whiteside and Marcus Daly insisted that the U.S. Senate investigate him for bribery and fraud.
Lying with criminal intent.
A Senate investigation found Clark guilty. In punishment, the Senate threatened to deny Clark his seat. But before the Senate could act, Clark resigned in a fury. The governor appointed Paris Gibson, founder of Great Falls, to take his place. When the legislature
assembled
again in 1901, they once again elected Clark to the U.S. Senate. By this time, Marcus Daly had died, and Clark was allowed to serve unchallenged. Labor unions and the People's Party. Many ordinary citizens disagreed with the way Clark, Daly, and other corporate bosses tried to control Montana politics. They organized to have their say by joining labor unions, organizations of employees that bargain with employers, and through political action. Sometimes the Copper Kings seemed to have a stranglehold over the state, but when the Copper Kings fought each other, working people gained more power. Labor unions gained strength. Joining together in a labor union was one of the main ways workers could gain power. Unions like the Butte Miners Union negotiated with mine owners for better pay and safer working conditions. Improving safety was especially important in the mines, where accidents killed an average of 1 miner every other day in the 1890s. The corporations had money, power, and political connections, but a union that represented all or most of the workers controlled whether or not the work got done. If conditions got too bad, a union might call a strike, an organized protest where workers refused to work. Belonging to a union was important to workers. The union helped its members when they were sick and helped pay for their funerals. But most importantly, unions gave workers a voice. Unions became very powerful in Butte, and they were very popular with their members. Marcus Daly and William A. Clark needed allies in their battles against each other, so they competed for their workers' loyalty and tolerated their unions. Populism, a people's political party. The Copper Kings' influence over politics and the widespread corruption of state politics made many Montanans angry. Corporate influence was not just a problem in Montana. Across the United States, as corporations grew in wealth and power, corporate owners gained increasing control over the nation's political and economic policies. In the early 1890s, a new political party formed in the United States to protest this control, the Populists. The Populist Party, populist means of the people, fought to give common people more voice in government. Populists protested laws and economic policies that favored the rich and powerful, and they demanded that the government pay closer attention to the needs of farmers, workers, and small businessmen. Populism, politics based on issues important to everyday people, really took hold in Montana, where corporate control and corruption of state government was so obvious. Many Montanans began campaigning for populist issues like mine safety laws and giving voters the right to elect U.S. senators. Populists also campaigned for women's right to vote. In 1892, the Montana Populists ran the first woman candidate for Attorney General, Ella Knowles, who was the first woman attorney
Lawyer
in Montana. She ran a strong race for Attorney General, even though women were not allowed to vote. She lost the election, but made a strong stand for women's political future in Montana. Silver and the Panic of 1893. Populists opposed policies that helped the rich get richer at the expense of the poor. But in the spring of 1893, the Populists saw all their worst fears realized when the nation suffered a horrible economic collapse. Banks closed, and millions of ordinary people lost their life savings. Although the economic depression lasted several years, it was called the Panic of 1893. The panic became even worse in Montana when the federal government decided to stop making silver coins in the fall of 1893. When the government stopped buying millions of ounces of silver for coins, Montana's silver mines closed. Silver town like Wicks and Granite became ghost towns overnight. Banks shut their doors. Within a few months, nearly 1/3 of Montana's workers, 20,000 people, lost their jobs. The people fight back. The panic created outrage among working people. Wealthy people had been able to protect themselves from the worst of the Depression by buying gold. When banks, mines, and other businesses closed, it was the working class that suffered the most. More Montanans switched to the Populist Party. In the next election, Montana Populists elected 16 representatives and senators to the state legislature. That same year, William Hogan, an unemployed worker from Butte, staged a spectacular demonstration of the people's outrage. Hogan heard that Populists across the country were organizing a big march on Washington, D.C. Jacob S. Coxey, their leader, intended to demand unemployment relief from the government. Hogan recruited more than 400 other jobless men from Butte to join Coxey's march on Washington. To get there, they took control of a Northern Pacific train and barreled eastward across the state. As they passed through Bozeman, Livingston, and Billings, people thronged the tracks in support. The state militia finally stopped Hogan and his men at Forsyth. There they arrested Hogan, who served 6 months in jail. But many Montanans supported Hogan and the others for trying to gain attention for the plight of the unemployed. War of the Copper Kings Part 2. Clark, Daly, and Hines. Montana's economy recovered by 1898, and the War of the Copper Kings began a new chapter. Marcus Daly sold part of the Anaconda Copper Mining Company to Henry H. Rogers and William Rockefeller, top executives of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. Standard Oil was one of the biggest oil companies in the world. Rogers and Rockefeller wanted to control the nation's copper industry just as they controlled much of the oil industry. So they formed a holding company, the corporation that owns other corporations, called Amalgamated Copper Company. Amalgamated began buying up other big Montana companies, including the Boston and Montana Company, Montana's second biggest copper producer, and most of William Clark's mines and smelters. Montanans began calling all of Amalgamated's copper operations simply the company. In 1900, Marcus Daly died. Daly had been one of the world's biggest industrialists but he was also a miner and a Montanan. When he died, his company fell under the complete control of Rogers and Rockefeller. They had little understanding of Montana, and no sympathy at all for the laborers who lived and worked here. The man who outsmarted Standard Oil. Frederick Augustus Heinz was 20 years old when he came to Butte in 1889 to work for the Boston and Montana Company. Heinz was handsome, free with his money, and smart. He built a smelter in 1892 to 1893, where he processed the ores of small independent mines. Then he had a daring idea. He bought a tiny mining claim called the Raris, which was only 10 feet wide and 70 feet long. Federal mining laws said that if a vein of ore rose to the surface on any given mining claim, the owner of that mining claim had the right to follow that vein no matter where it led, even if it trespassed into other claims. This law was called the Apex Law, named after the apex, highest part, of a vein of ore. Heinz knew that just a few feet underground, Butte's immensely rich hill became a tangle of ore veins. These veins were more interconnected than veins in most other mines in the world. He also knew that it would be hard to prove which vein apexed where. So Heinz simply began tunneling from the Raris into all the veins that apexed on his claim, which happened to connect to 3 enormous copper mines owned by Amalgamated and the Boston and Montana Company. Amalgamated immediately sued to stop him, but Heinz was ready for that. He claimed in court that the Apex Law gave him ownership over the 3 major copper mines on the hill. Heinz demanded that the judge shut Amalgamated down. Heinz had 2 powerful friends who were judges in the Butte courts. He had spent great sums of money to get these 2 judges elected. In every court case Amalgamated brought, these 2 judges sided with Heinz. Amalgamated appealed its cases all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, but these appeals took time. Meanwhile, Heinz crews worked 24 hours a day, quickly and efficiently removing millions of dollars of copper ore from Amalgamated's properties. By 1902, Heinz had 37 lawyers fighting nearly 100 lawsuits. These lawsuits did not scare Heinz. For one thing, his mining profits far exceeded his legal costs. And for another, most of Butte and much of Montana liked him. Frederick Heinz spent his money in local businesses, spread his wealth around, and made many friends. Amalgamated, on the other hand, was run from New York City by a company known for being ruthless with its employees. The company that Daly had started began to lose support among Montanans. When Heinz said that Standard Oil wanted to own everyone in Montana, people believed him. Amalgamated shuts down the state. Tied up in hundreds of lawsuits, Amalgamated made a power play. On October 23, 1903, the company abruptly shut down all its Montana operations: mines, smelters, railroad, logging operations, and mills. 15,000 people were locked out of work. Montana's economy screeched to a standstill. Amalgamated kept only its newspapers operating, and they loudly blamed the shutdown on Heinz. A few days later, an angry crowd of 10,000 people, many of them unemployed miners, mobbed the downtown streets to protest the shutdown. They demanded to hear what Heinz had to say. Heinz strode up the steps of the courthouse and faced the crowd. "My friends," he said, "the Amalgamated Copper Company is the greatest menace that any community could possibly have within its boundaries." The crowd grew quiet as Heinz went on. "These people are my enemies, fierce, bitter, implacable,
unforgiving,
but they are your enemies too. If they crush me today, they will crush you tomorrow. They will cut wages and raise the tariff
price
in the company stores on every bite you eat and every rag you wear. They will force you to dwell in Standard Oil houses while you live, and they will bury you in Standard Oil coffins when you die." When he finished, a loud roar of support rose from the crowd. Whether Heinz's legal tricks had caused the shutdown or not, most people were angry at Amalgamated. They needed to feed their families. Winter was beginning. Thousands wrote letters to Governor Joseph K. Toole demanding for help, but Governor Toole could not order Amalgamated to reopen. Then Amalgamated made an offer. The company printed a message in the Anaconda Standard saying that if Governor Toole would call a special session of the legislature to move the court cases out of Butte, where Hines controlled the courts, the company would resume operations and Montanans could go back to work. Should corporations make decisions for the legislature? Governor Toole had a problem. Should he let Amalgamated dictate when the legislature should meet and what laws they should pass? On the other hand, should he let the shutdown go on, knowing that thousands of Montanans would suffer far more than Amalgamated's corporate executives would? The shutdown already had lasted almost a month. People were going hungry. Almost every business, large or small, felt the pinch. Governor Toole called the special session on December 1st, 1903. In his opening speech, he urged the legislators to remember that whatever laws they passed would affect not just Amalgamated, but all of Montana. You are legislating for the future of the whole state, he reminded them. The legislators did exactly what Amalgamated demanded. They passed a fair trials bill, allowing anyone who thought that one court was unfair to move their court case to another town. Under this law, Amalgamated could sue Hines in other towns besides Butte, where Hines controlled the judges. The day after this law passed, Amalgamated gave the signal to reopen, and Montanans went back to work. Amalgamated Copper Company wins the war. Amalgamated had won the last battle in the War of the Copper Kings. In 1906, Hines sold his mining interest to the company for $12 million and moved to New York City. Burton K. Wheeler, who became a U.S. Senator from Montana, later wrote, "The lesson for Butte was clear. No matter how clever, unscrupulous,
dishonest,
or spendthrift the opponent, you couldn't lick Amalgamated." 4 years later, William Clark sold his mining interests to Amalgamated as well. In 1915, Amalgamated merged all of the companies it controlled into a single company, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. Crisis in the labor unions. Labor unions had done well under Daly and Clark. When Hines arrived, he supported the labor unions and used them as allies. He agreed to the union's demand for an 8-hour workday to gain the loyalty of his workers. But Amalgamated was an Eastern company. Back east, corporations and labor unions fought intense, bloody battles. Amalgamated came on the scene already hostile to labor unions. In 1900, Amalgamated secretly began to send its own men, and sometimes trained detectives, to join the unions and to work their way into leadership positions. Within a few years, the company controlled the unions. In 1906, the Butte Miners Union asked Amalgamated for a 50-cent wage increase. Miners had made $3.50 per day, about $70 today, for almost 15 years. During that time, the cost of living had increased, and so had company profits. Amalgamated offered a raise of 25 cents instead. The company-controlled union leaders accepted the lower raise, and even wrote Amalgamated a letter of thanks. The union's working men were outraged. They saw that their own union leaders had betrayed them. The union split into two factions. The leaders stayed loyal to the company, while committed union members called for a strike. It looked like the union might tear itself apart. At this point, the company took charge, once again closing its mines. The committed union men struggled to maintain the strike, while the company union men argued against it. But strikes only work when everyone participates. Without a unified voice, the union had no power. The company-controlled union leaders remained in control of the union, and the mines opened again. Montana's labor unions had learned an important lesson. When different companies compete against one another, labor unions gain strength and negotiating power on behalf of workers. When one company holds a monopoly,
exclusive control,
labor unions lose strength. This lesson hit home in 1912, when Amalgamated issued rustling cards. Each miner had to get a card from the company before he could rustle, round up work. Anyone who spoke out against the company lost his card and could not work. In one simple act, Amalgamated wiped out much of the union's power. Union members continued to fight for workers' rights, and they sometimes won small victories, but the unions would not regain real strength until the 1930s.
See Chapter 18.
Stepping into a new century. Montana faced many challenges in its early years. Political corruption, tension between rural and industrial parts of the state, and too much power in the hands of a few. Many of these early problems continue to trouble the state in the 20th century. Yet citizens did not give up trying to make things better. Another political movement would arise after the turn of the century to challenge the power of the company and fight for honest government. This new movement was called progressivism.
See Chapter 15.
Expressions of the people, the Montana Capitol. When Montana became a state, it needed a state capitol building. A capitol building provides a home for government offices and a place for the legislature to meet. It is also a symbol.
Something that represents an idea or an event.
The architecture of Montana's Capitol building shows how people felt about statehood and about the United States. Its stone exterior symbolizes the strength of Montana's people and the solidity of its future. The stone came from Stillwater County, near Columbus. Architects gave the building marble columns and a 165-foot high dome. These neoclassical
reflecting Greek and Roman traditions
elements symbolize the strength and wisdom of Western civilization as carried forth by the United States. The dome is topped with copper, signifying the richness of Montana's natural resources. The elaborately decorated Capitol building reflected Montana's sophistication in the early 1900s. Montanans wanted to show that even though their state was far away from the centers of fashion and power, it could still build a grand capital. People also wanted their temple of democracy to be a building of grace, stability, and dignity. The Capitol holds 36 permanent murals, numerous stained glass windows and ceilings, historic paintings, and sculptures that celebrate the rich and varied history of the state. Architects Charles E. Bell and John H. Kent designed the building and supervised its construction. The Capitol cost approximately $500,000 to build. Thomas Cruz, the owner of one of Montana's richest gold and silver mines, helped finance the project. Helena real estate developer Peter Wynn donated 17 acres of land more than a mile from Helena's downtown. The cornerstone of the building was laid July 4, 1899, and the building was completed in 1902. In 1909, the building was already too crowded, and work began to add wings to both ends of the original building. The new wings were completed in 1912. After almost 100 years of use, the Capitol was renovated in 1999 to 2000. Today, the Capitol stands as a monument to Montana's distinctive heritage and the democratic ideals of its people.